Oh shit, here we go! It's on! Race war!
A couple of weeks of non-stop cultural enrichment has finally set the country off, and we've got a lot of riots and demonstrations going on, a lot of civil unrest. And it's something that's been brewing for a long time in the UK and was always going to happen. But there were quite a few catalysts in the last couple of weeks that led up to it. The main catalyst was the butchering of 3 little girls, and a load more were attacked as well and injured at a dance class at the hands of one of the culturally enriching types, as I'm going to call them, so that YouTube doesn't get too grumpy with me. But that's not the only reason that these riots are happening. I mean, just in the last 2 weeks, a soldier was shanked, a female dog walker got her head caved in, 2 police women were beaten up at an airport. There were other riots, and then of course the 3 little girls being killed. And that's just the major news stories that we heard of. There are many more that get underreported or don't make the headlines or are outright covered up. And all of these things I've mentioned happened at the hands of the culturally enriching. But the spark that really lit up the tinderbox actually wasn't any of what I mentioned. The final straw was when a vigil was being held for the 3 little girls who were killed, and another culturally enriching type turned up with a knife. And that was the final straw. However, the mainstream media kind of kept that part quiet. When the riots started happening, they really underreported that a guy had turned up with a knife at the memorial. And that's what kicked it all off. That part's been ignored by mainstream media, and it's just right-wing bigots, blah blah blah. Now, I don't want to seem like I'm condoning the riots, because being violent towards people, attacking people who have done nothing wrong, destroying people's property, innocent people's property, isn't going to solve anything. It actually makes things worse, because it undermines any intelligent argument that you might have, and the government and mainstream media especially can use that against you. They can dismiss any legitimate argument and just say, well, they're just thugs, just criminals, let's implement more laws and restrictions and controls on people's lives. I mean, the government have been desperate for any excuse to implement more controls over the internet for years now, because they don't like the spread of free information. They like all of the information that we're exposed to be filtered through the establishment narrative and what they consider us allowed to know. They want to control the information outputs. If they control the information that we have access to, they control us. They can manipulate who you vote for, how you live your life, if you're only exposed to information that they want you exposed to. And so going around, setting fire to innocent people's cars, attacking innocent people, it just plays into their hands. And it's going to end up with us slipping further into 1984 than we already are. And the government getting more control and censorship over the internet will be disastrous. Because the internet's the only place you can find the truth. Yeah, there's a lot of bullshit on there as well. We've got to admit that. But people can actually report what they're seeing and hearing with their own eyes and ears. They can film it on their phones. Everyone's got a camera in their pocket now. So you can get the truth of what's going on and not what's filtered through the mainstream media propaganda machine. And we've seen a lot of that this week. The media reporting is not accurate to what's been going on. They're conveniently ignoring underlying issues and reasons for what's going on. They're hiding certain information. And they do this all the time. I mean, there's a documentary on YouTube called Silenced that I'd recommend going to watch, which highlights just one case of something that happened in the UK. The media put their spin on it and turned the story into something very different from the truth. And when someone tried to reveal the truth of what happened, they were censored and silenced. And there were attempts to gag them. And that was just one instance of it, and it happens all the time. I mean, every week, if you really look into it, there are things going on that we are not told about. And a lot of it to do with multiculturalism and immigration. I think if the people of the UK knew the truth about the cost of unlimited and illegal immigration, not just the financial cost, which is a lot, but the cost when it comes to crime, our infrastructure being overloaded, the environment, because obviously more people, more pollution, the rise in crime, the rise in diseases even, because a lot of these people who are coming into the country undocumented, as well as having no criminal record that we can look at, they also have no medical records, and so we're seeing illnesses brought into the country that we had pretty much gotten rid of. But the majority of these stories get censored, or they get twisted, or they just don't get reported at all, so that we don't know the truth. Because I think if we did, probably 90% of the country would be very much against unlimited immigration. And that's not to do with racism, that's not to do with race at all, it's to do with simple numbers and the practicality of it all. You can't have infinite growth on a finite amount of space with finite resources. It's also a cultural thing. You can't expect vastly different cultures to be able to gel together into a unified society. There's a language barrier, a cultural barrier, a history barrier. You know, some of these cultures are very different to ours. And something that highlights this is when recently, on top of the cases that I mentioned earlier that were reported, there's also a big thing made a couple of weeks ago in the mainstream media about the rise in domestic abuse in the UK. One of the things that may well be contributing to the rise in domestic abuse is that we now have tens of thousands of people in the country from cultures that do not view women the same way we do. They don't value them the same way. They don't think that they have the same rights as men do. They have a very different attitude to them. But the mainstream media won't mention that that might possibly be a contributing factor in the rise of domestic abuse. So they'll bleat on about it being a problem. They won't address some of the reasons behind it. And so what's the point? You might as well not even mention it. You're not going to talk about the root causes behind it. Same with climate change, when they bang on about climate change and how concerned they are for the environment. I've said this before. You can't bleat on about how concerned you are for the environment while you're destroying it all to build houses. Why are we building more houses? Why are we concreting over all of the natural world in the UK? Well, because we're overpopulating the place, in no small part because of the unlimited immigration. But they won't ever mention that. So once again, don't even bother going on about it then. There's no point. If you're not going to address some of the root causes of these problems, don't bother reporting them. Another thing that's been fueling the riots is the two-tier policing, the two-tier media response, and the two-tier government response. Because there were some riots in Leeds a couple of weeks ago because some children were taken into care because the authorities considered them to be endangered where they were living. This caused a lot of people who were, the culturally enriching types, shouting about Alan's snack bar, to come out and riot, and the police ran away from them. There was another incident where a couple of policewomen were beaten up at an airport. Luckily there was a policeman there with them. He got attacked from behind, and the culturally enriching types who were attacking him got a few licks in, punched him from behind. He got angry, kicked one of them in the head, and there was a big uproar about that. And once again, their friends, the culturally enriching types, all rioted over that, and the police pretty much ignored, just let them get on with it, very softly. The government didn't have much to say about it. The media was very soft in their reporting of it and their descriptions of these people, even though they were rioting because a policeman got angry over the fact that two of his colleagues were beaten up. A female police officer had her nose broken. He was punched in the back of the head and set upon by like 3 men. And I'm no supporter of the police particularly. They're not our friends. They've proven that this week. They're not there to protect us. But still, you can kind of understand in that situation. But these people seem to think they can come here, do what the hell they like, and then riot about it when they're called out on it. And the media and the police kind of bow down to them. Same with BLM a few years ago. The government, they were dropping to the goddamn knees. The police were dropping to their knees, even though they were setting fire to things and attacking people, attacking cars, causing trouble. But it's all the softly approach and very sympathetic. But when people start rioting because they've had enough of all these crimes that I listed earlier, that had built up just in the space of 2 weeks, all those things I listed earlier, this soldier getting stabbed, the woman getting her head caved in, attack on police officers at the airport, and these poor little girls. When people have finally had enough of that and riot, the government, the media, the police were there in riot gear, on horseback. The government have come out saying we're going to crack down hard, we're going to fast track these people through the court system, they're going to be arrested and put in prison straight away. Why don't you have that response when any other culture, when any of the guest cultures that are living here kick off? How come it's only when the natives do that all of a sudden the prisons, which you said were full, you've been letting people out of prison early. That's the plan, because we're running out of prison spaces. Once again, why are we running out of prison spaces? Don't talk about it. Much like, not to get sidetracked here, but the media also reported about a month or two back, about how there are massive queues for the dentists and for doctors and that in the country. The NHS, all our infrastructure is being overloaded. Why is it being overloaded? Don't mention it. Don't talk about it. But it's the same with, the prisons are overloaded for the same reason. But all of a sudden they've got space to lock up British people who are rioting because of these horrible things that have happened to their country, and they're fed up with it. And once again, I don't want to seem like I'm supporting the rioters, because I don't think it's a good idea. Rising up in protest, yes, is about time. But getting violent and destructive is not going to help at all. It's just going to make it easy to demonise you and dismiss any legitimate arguments you have. But just to quickly finish off on what I was saying about the NHS and our infrastructure being overloaded, the mainstream media reported on it. Didn't report the reasons why it's all overloaded, but they did show footage of NHS dentists and doctors and the queues outside, and nary a white person in sight. So they kind of gave away what's causing the problem without outright mentioning it, but it was there for us all to see. But this underlying resentment has been brewing for years. No one ever voted for unlimited immigration. No one ever voted for illegal immigration to be basically decriminalised. But it keeps happening, and we can't vote our way out of it, because the system is rigged to maintain the status quo of Labour Conservatives. So we can't vote our way out of it. No matter how much people have complained about it, the government, the media will not listen. They just ignore it. What else are people to do? And especially as times are getting harder, people are having to work all the hours just to scrape by. Their lives are getting harder and harder. There's more and more of a squeeze on them from governments and councils to squeeze more and more money out of them, more and more time out of them. And then you see that a massive chunk of the taxes you pay after working so hard go towards illegal immigrants who are criminals. They've entered the country illegally. They're criminals as soon as they enter the country. And yet you're working your arse off, barely scraping by, and it's all being pissed away on people who have broken the law, who then get given a load of freebies. Free accommodation, free food, free taxis, free phones, free everything. Of course that's going to piss people off. And they're working their arse off, only just scraping by, and then a load of their hard-earned money is pissed away like that on criminals. Of course that's going to breed resentment. And the thing with people entering the country illegally is, if the very first thing they do when coming to the UK is break a very serious law, going into a country illegally, basically invading the country, that's a very serious law to break. They're willing to break that law. You can't expect them to come into the country and then all of a sudden abide by all our other laws and rules. It's ridiculous to expect that when the very act of entering the country has been breaking a very, very serious law. And not only have they broken that law, but they've found that they can get away with it and actually be rewarded for it. So that's a terrible lesson to teach people coming into the country. You can't then expect them to abide by all the other laws and rules and respect them, because you haven't taught them respect. You've taught them they can do what they like and get a load of freebies. And it's not about race, it's not about skin colour, it's the sheer practicality of it, of having such unlimited immigration. Especially, the illegal immigration especially is obviously a problem because it's illegal. But even unlimited legal immigration is something that's quite unnatural. It's something that we haven't had to this extent in human history. So you can't argue that it's perfectly fine and there won't be any negative effects of it. The levels of immigration that we're seeing now into the Western world are pretty much unheard of in human history outside of outright invasions of countries. So it's kind of absurd that there's this constant propaganda to make us believe that, it's not really having any effect, it's perfectly fine, perfectly natural. And there is a lot of propaganda to try and make us believe that it's always been this way. It's unbelievably cheeky, really, that they, kind of like the 1984 saying, the party tried to make you believe what they told you and not what you experienced with your eyes and ears. I'm misquoting, but it's something along those lines. And that's what we see all the time with propaganda now in the media. Anyone over 30 realises it's propaganda, because we remember that the country wasn't always like this and immigration wasn't always like this. But for younger people who are growing up on this, where every historical documentary and drama on British TV now is full of diversity, and they portray, you know, the UK 100 years ago, 50 years ago, as multicultural and diverse as it is today, you know, younger people don't know any better because they didn't experience the world before globalism and multiculturalism. So they don't know how much nicer it was. All the media propaganda is showing them, oh yeah, it was always this way, don't question it, it was always like this. And there's really something quite sinister about the rewriting of history in that way. That's, once again, something out of 1984, really. And it's something that people who are noticing it are pissed off about. It's another thing that's breeding resentment, that our history and our culture is all being appropriated in that way. That adds to the growing sense of anger and resentment that's now bubbling over. And when you feel like you can't trust your media or your government or your police, once again, that's something that breeds resentment. And people don't feel like they can trust them anymore. These services that we pay for with our taxes, that are supposed to be there to represent us, have ignored us for a decade now on immigration and illegal immigration. And at the same time that there are the riots by the white British people at the minute, there's also some riots from fans of Alan's Snack Bar. And yet the police response to them even now is very different. It's two-tier. And these people are walking around with machetes and iron bars, and yet the police response to them is, oh, don't worry, we're here to help you, we're your friends, we'll look after you. And they've been attacking and beating up innocent people, and yet the police and the media haven't got a bad word to say about them. People are tired of constantly being lied to about immigration and importing the third world. You know, there's a saying that import the third world, become the third world, and I think there's truth to that. The idea that, oh, it's culturally enriching. Well, how? They come from shitholes and they know that. That's why they come here, because we've got it better than they have in their own countries, which is fair enough. You want to go somewhere nicer. But you can't say that people coming from countries that are utter shitholes are going to culturally enrich ours. If they were that culturally enriching, they'd stay behind and enrich their own countries. We'd all be fleeing there. We'd all be fleeing there for the enrichment of their countries, but we're not. So it's utter bullshit saying, oh, they're so culturally enriching. No. Their countries are shitholes because of their cultures and belief and attitudes. But unfortunately, a lot of them bring those things here. Even though they recognise we've got it better here, they don't seem to quite put two and two together and realise, well, maybe the reason we've got it better here is because of our culture. And I know, you know, many of them do integrate, but a lot of them don't, and they want to bring their own culture here. And the government and the media do seem to have a bit of an attitude that we should integrate with their cultures. Well, no. If I'm moving there, I'll integrate with their cultures, but if they're moving here, they should be integrating with our culture, not the other way around. You integrate with the host culture of where you've moved to. You know, and another issue caused by immigration, and this isn't the immigrants' fault, but they do get taken advantage of a lot by employers. They're very, very compliant. And that's why all these rich corporations and businesses love it so much, love unlimited immigration, because they've got basically a slave class they're bringing in. Because a lot of these people come from countries where working conditions are really bad, they come here and conditions that we might consider bad, they don't think are so bad. Which makes them very compliant, on top of the fact that a lot of them don't have the best grasp on English, so they don't really understand their rights or what's in their contracts. You know, they'll just basically do whatever they're told. And businesses take advantage of this, which unfortunately lowers the standards for the rest of us, because if you're in a job and you don't like the working conditions, you don't think the working conditions are right, or you think that the company are taking the mick a bit, pushing what they want out of you when it's not in your contract, if you don't like it, yeah, these businesses will go through the motions and consult with you on things, but ultimately their attitude is, well, if you don't like it, there's the door, and there's 100 immigrant workers who will do the job and keep their mouths shut. I mean, the immigrants I've worked with in the past have all been really nice, respectful people. There's the odd one or two that are a dick, but that's the same with anyone, you know. But like I say, the main problem was they were just too compliant. And part of that's also because they're afraid of losing their work visas and being shipped off back to the homeland. So even if they do realise they're being taken advantage of, they still won't really speak up about it. Which, once again, it kind of lowers the standard for the rest of us. Now, the things I've mentioned today aren't necessarily my own opinions. I don't necessarily agree with all of them, but you can't deny that these are all reasons why resentment has grown. And they're all legitimate reasons, really, for people to become angry and frustrated, and it's boiled over into the violence we're seeing now, which I don't agree with the violence. I don't think there's any need for that, and I don't think it's going to accomplish anything. But people have not been listened to, and especially working class people, I think, are affected by a lot of this more than sort of upper middle class and upper class. And if anything, the rich are outright benefiting from it. I think that specifically a very tiny percentage of very rich people are benefiting greatly from it, and that's why it's being pushed so hard with all the propaganda and all the governments and authorities going along with it. But I don't think anything good's going to come from these riots. I think it's going to push more of a police state. They're already talking about more restrictions on information on social media. They're already talking about more facial recognition technology. I mean, God, it's just going to become even more Orwellian in the UK than it already is. And the thing is, we're at a point where the demographics have changed so much that even if they did, which they're not going to, but even if they did say, right, we are going to start limiting as much immigration as we've been getting, and we're going to actually make illegal immigration illegal, not irregular immigration, which is some rebranding that the government have been doing. They started calling it irregular immigration rather than illegal immigration. I mean, I'll just go and irregularly withdraw money from a bank then, shall I? But even if they did start to limit immigration and stop illegal immigration, the demographics have changed so much now that it's not really going to make a difference. I think in 20 years' time, we're going to be living in a very different country. But the irony is that a lot of these more so-called liberally minded people who have crusaded for unlimited immigration no matter the cost are going to find that in a few decades' time, the new culture that becomes prevalent are not as liberally minded as we are and not as tolerant as we are. It really is a case of the chickens inviting the foxes into the hen house. But I think the government and local councils have a belief that more people equals more money. So if they just keep pouring more and more people in, they'll eventually make enough money to get the country and all the councils out of the ridiculous amount of debt they're in, which they won't. Because the more people are poured in, the more services are needed, the more our infrastructure is overwhelmed, and the more they're going to have to build schools and prisons and doctors' surgeries. And so the cost at best breaks even, but I think the cost is actually outstripping what we're making back, especially because most of the illegal immigrants are not going to come into the country illegally and then just settle down and live life by the book. A lot of them are coming here for the freebies. So it's a massive, millions upon millions upon millions being spunked away. You're not going to make that money back to get the UK out of the financial hole it's in. There's a fallacy to think that just pouring more and more people in will eventually pay off. It's going to, like I say, at best break even financially, but I think it's actually costing us more than it's making us. One of the arguments for immigration is that birth rates in white Westerners have been declining, and so we need to import more workers, basically, especially as we have an ageing population. But no one really addresses the issue of why birth rates are falling with white Westerners. And that's quite a complex issue. I mean, I'm not going to go into that here. That's really a separate video. But that's something that needs addressing, which never is. And personally, my thoughts on it are that maybe that's nature's way. If birth rates are declining, maybe that's nature's way of telling us that we're overpopulating and we need to calm it down a bit. And yeah, that means in the long run, for a while, we're going to have less money. But is our more affluent society now making anyone happier? No one seems happier. On any side of the political spectrum, no one seems happy with modern life. Even though we've got more money, more cars, Sky TV, more delicacies, more yummy cakes and things than people had back in the 80s, is anyone happier? It is sad and frustrating that even with what's happening now, the media and the government refuse to accept any of the reasoning behind it. There's a lot of propaganda I've heard in the media blaming misinformation online, so let's start censoring online more. Putin was brought up. They even tried to blame Putin somehow. I'm surprised they didn't blame climate change. I mean, all the usual excuses were coming out, all the usual establishment approved blames have been reported. So yeah, we're kind of fucked.
The world is burning. Let's mask